thank you for being here with Rabbanit Leah Sarna for The Gates of Crying Were Not Locked, Crying Adults and Crying Children in Classical Jewish Texts. Rabbanit Sarna is the faculty advisor to the team programs at Drisha and a former director of team programs. She previously served as director of religious engagement at Anshe Shalom B'nai Yisrael congregation in Chicago, a leading urban Orthodox congregation. She has lectured in Orthodox synagogues and Jewish communal settings around the world and loves spreading her warm, energetic love for Torah and mitzvot with Jews at all stages of life. And tonight we're beginning a new series, which I'm very excited for myself, which again is called The Gates of Crying Were Not Locked. And I'm going to just read the blurb because it's the first night, which is crying gets our attention. When adults cry, our hearts break for them. When children cry, we run to them. When humans cry, even in exile and diaspora, Hashem hears it. What is crying about? Why is it so powerful? Is it ever right to tell someone to stop crying? So I think I'm really excited for this topic. I think just this past week's Parsha had a cameo of an adult crying. And it's something that I think is pretty striking throughout all of Tanakh. So I'm really excited. And thank you, Rabbanit Sarna, and thank you to everyone for being here. So thank you again for being here. Thank you, Rabbanit Sarna, and enjoy. Happy New Year.
Hi, everyone. First of all, it's so fun to be back. And I'm loving this new format. I feel like this is way better than what Trisha used to do. So this is all great. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, I am trying to write a book about the beginning, like pregnancy, birth, the beginning of life. And so whenever I teach on topics like this, it's like workshopping ideas I have for that book. But I really want to, with this class, start with first principles and also expand beyond children. But when I'm thinking about it for the book, like what I'm especially interested in or excited by are sort of like two issues. One is like sleep training, and sleep training often involves a not insignificant amount of crying. So that's sort of one thing. And then the other thing that I'm curious about is sort of like what are the claims that crying makes on us and what like supersedes those. So when you have your first kid, anytime they cry, you just like run to them. But when you have a second kid, all of a sudden you're like, what if they're both crying? Or like one of them is doing something dangerous and the baby is crying. Or like what if you're cooking dinner and the baby is crying? Do you stop everything that you're doing because the baby's crying, or do you say, okay, babies cry sometimes, people cry sometimes, but like I'm not a slave to crying. I have to make decisions for myself about what is right in this moment, what my priorities are, how I live in this world. And then it's thank you. Like crying is communication. It's telling me something. But what I do based on the information being communicated is still up to me instead of this like immediate, like, oh my gosh, you're crying and I'm responding immediately kind of thing. Um, and that's all like really interesting with regards to babies. And I think the question of like, what is the ethical pull of crying? And specifically, and we'll get to this like all the way at the end, but like, are you allowed to daven while your baby is crying, for example? Is this big motif for those of you who ever studied at like a yeshivat Har Etzion institution? You might be familiar with a story that was very beloved and foundational Torah of Amital, Zichrono Livracha, about like hearing the baby's cries. We'll talk about it in the third class. We're going to talk about all this stuff. But if you grew up in those institutions or you have any connection to them, then there's this idea that like your Beit Midrash should be a place where you hear the baby crying, and that should like overwhelm other obligations. And then you have a kid and they're crying, and you're like, well, my baby cries all the time, and if I don't ignore my baby a little bit, I'll never get to daven. I'll never get to learn. I'll never get to do the things that make me feel human. And it comes from this perspective of like non-primary caretaker. And so what do those stories do for us as a cultural motif? It's not the only one, actually. There's also, we'll see the story about Rabbi Salanter, who missed Kol Nidre because he heard a baby crying on his way to Kol Nidre. When we hear stories like that, they sort of make a certain claim about what's more important than the other. But it's like, okay, if this is all the time for me, how can I live in this world if I never get to daven or I never get to do anything, or whatever, a million different critiques from the primary caretaker perspective on those stories. And so as I was looking and thinking about those stories and thinking about the kind of parenting questions that I had for this book, I started looking at, and this is what we're going to do today, like crying in the Torah. Because it's actually really surprising. There's a lot of babies in the Torah. There's a lot of birth. There's a lot of creation of humans. You would just think like today when humans are created, those humans cry. Like there's a way in which you want to hear like, and then Hashem created Adam Harishon, and Adam Harishon's first thing in this world was to cry, right? And in fact, when your baby cries for the first time, it's actually really good. Like if your baby doesn't cry when they're first born, that's scary. That's like a bad sign. Something, there needs to be an intervention, right? So you kind of would have hoped that like actually the first thing that would happen when Adam Harishon was created, or if not Adam Harishon, maybe Chava, or maybe their first child, or whatever, like someone should have cried. But in fact, and we'll talk about this at length tonight, the first person who cries in the Torah is none other than Hagar, which is so strange and surprising. And to me, what that represents is that the Torah is not particularly interested in the crying of babies. The Torah is very interested in crying. There are some 115 times that the root bacha appears in Tanakh. There are always individuals or like personified, right? We'll see Jerusalem cries, for example, okay? But they're right people or personified things that are crying, but it's always an adult version with one exception, and we're going to start with that exception. So now I'm going to share my screen, and we can put the source sheet in the chat for people who want to follow along on their own as well. And what I did, and what I'm gonna walk you through is I didn't put on every single time that the root bacha appears here, but I tried to make seder out of it, such that every time you see someone crying in Tanakh, you'll have the categories, and then you can say the categories of why people cry. I think it's quite limited. It's like surprisingly limited. And then you get to say, okay, which of these categories does this instance of crying fall into? And sometimes it's not clear, and sometimes the Parshanut tries to say something that might seem a little different than the Pshat or something like that. But even when the Parshanim are playing games like that, or the Midrash is playing games like that, it's always just moving it from one category to another. It's never something like more sophisticated. I don't know, sophisticated is the wrong word, but it's never something like more complicated or the addition of another category. And in each category, there's a lot of examples. So I just think that's also really interesting. Like I'm a person, as an adult, I cry a lot. I cry for lots of different reasons. And I wouldn't say that the only reasons that I cry are the ones that exist within the categories that I'm going to lay out tonight. So I think that just opens up a lot of questions about what is crying about in our stories. And then once we sort of laid out like crying in Tanakh, which is what we're going to do tonight, we're going to move forward in time, and we're going to talk about crying in a classical rabbinic text next time, and then move even more forward in the Jewish library after that. And in the last class, we're going to talk about some of that, like Rav Salanter of Amital, like those kinds of like Hasidic story type things at the very end. Okay, so here we go. We're going to share my screen, and okay, thank you. And I'm going to make it bigger. I'm going to make this bigger. Okay. All right. So the first thing I just wanted to start out with is that Kohelet obviously has a sort of definitional thing going on, in that when you think about something and you think about its opposite, that choice of like what is the opposite of that thing actually tells you something about the thing you're trying to define, right? So like sometimes when in general, right, when you're trying to define something, you can sometimes say, oh, it's the opposite of this, and then you actually can grasp what it is. And so the idea that crying is the opposite of laughter, I think is really interesting. And then the next level of bichya and schok are tzfod ve'irkod, a time for wailing, or a time for eulogizing, and a time for dancing. So there's weeping and laughing, which like one person does alone potentially, or maybe a group of people do it together. And then svod and rakod are certainly like meant to be outward facing, public, second personal. Like there's a much like, I don't know, maybe it's like tuned up or louder version when it's Svod and Rakod. It's your whole body. It's not just your face. It's not just your emotions. It's speech. It's movement. But the idea that Livkod and Svod go together, that maybe there's no such thing. We're going to get to this because I think you might think at least that there are examples of happy cries in Tanakh, very few, very far between. But one in this week's Parsha, potentially, when Yaakov meets Rachel, he cries. What's that about? So I want to, right? You might think like if you're going to come up with an example of a happy cry in Tanakh, I think that's probably your best attempt. You have also Ezra, but the people are crying in Ezra while other people are laughing. It's actually meant to be opposites, the crying and the laughing with the building a second Beit HaMikdash. We'll see that also. Oh, we'll see. Oh, no, not that one. I didn't bring in every example. We'll see another example from Ezra. And then, but in any event, right? So the idea that Bechya and Livkod and Lischuk are opposites, I think is already very interesting because it's limiting on what crying is about. Crying is the opposite of laughter. Crying is sad. Whereas I actually think that frequently there's an experience of I laughed so hard that I cried, which the Kohelet certainly doesn't leave space for. I laughed so hard that I cried. Kohelet maybe just wouldn't recognize that as crying. Like it just wouldn't be called crying. The fact of tears coming out of your tear ducts is not the crying that Kohelet is including in Bacha, which is totally reasonable, by the way, right? Bacha is not necessarily about just the physical tears coming out of my eyes, which I think is likely true for all of the examples that we're going to see in Tanakh, that actually we're not so interested in the like tears piece of crying, that there's something more specifically about crying as an expression of sadness. That is what the root boche gets at. Okay, so moving on from Kohelet. So right, when we think about crying, like who cries? Oh, you're a crybaby, right? Like the paradigmatic crier is a baby. Okay, and I mentioned before, right? No babies cry in Tanakh. A million people are born. None of them cry. And the only child who does cry is Moshe. Moshe cries. Okay, so and it's a very important part in the narrative because, right, you think, oh, Bat Paro heard him crying. That's not exactly what happens. So let's take a look. I brought you the whole thing, but we'll just look at the relevant part. So Bat Paro goes down to wash in the Nile, and her Narotel, Chod al Yad HaYaor, and her maidens are walking along the Nile. And then someone, either Bat Paro or the maidens, but likely Bat Paro, but Terat HaTeva Betoch HaSuf, she spied the basket among the reeds, and then certainly here, Vatishlachet Amata Vatikach, and then she sent her Ama and to get it. So it seems like she sent her slave girl. Obviously, there's the Midrash that her Ama, meaning this, right? That her arm extended and whatever. That's a really interesting Midrash, but almost certainly not the like plainest meaning of the text, right? And she sent her slave girl to go get it. So why does Bat Paro go get Moshe? Because she sees the teva. So it's actually not about hearing, it's about sight. And then she opens it, and then she sees, right, Vatiftach, and then she sees Vater Ehu et Hayeled, and then she sees the baby, and then she sees Vehine Na'ar Bocha. So first of all, right, the Midrash, we're going to see these Midrashim in a second, is fascinated. Why is it 1 second it's Yeled and 1 second it's Na'ar? And usually when you think about those two words, Yeled and Na'ar, we think of Na'ar as more grown up than Yeled. So those are not describing the same kind of period of development that Yeled is like related to Laledet, like it's a newborn, not exactly a newborn yet. Not every Yeled is a newborn, but like a small child, and Nar is like maybe like puberty-ish age child. Anyways, so that's also weird. Like, what's happening there? The Midrash is very interested. But the point being that the crying happens here, and this is the only baby who cries in the whole of Tanakh. So, like, pay attention. But that's not why Bat Paro was interested in him. But it is what causes, or seemingly potentially what causes, Vatachmol alav. It's not why she took out the tiva, but it seems to be why she took pity on him. He's crying, and it causes a pity response in Bat Paro that changes the course of Jewish history, right? She's crying, she takes pity, Vatomar, and she says, this must be a Hebrew child, and the rest is history. See Parshat Shemot. Okay, but right, so like what happens? The only baby who cries in all of Tanakh, Moshe cries, and it causes a pity response in Bat Paro. Okay, but this pasuk is too strange for the Parshanut to just leave behind. There's lots of different ideas about what is happening here. So, right, the Gemara in Sota, one of many midrashim, points out Hinei Na'ar Bocha, and then says Kari Yeled, the Kari Na'ar. It says it's a Yeled, and then like the pasuk calls him a Yeled, and then it calls him a Na'ar. So, what's happening here? Hu Yeled v'kolo Kena'ar, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, he's the age of like this baby, right? The Torah says he's 3 months. Right, because Yocheved, you can see it above here. Yocheved was able to hide him, or whatever, Ishami Beit Levi, it was able to hide him, and then also, like, why was she only able to hide him for 3 months? What is 3 months? I always think about this in terms of like maternity leave, 3 months. But then also, maybe he was like born 3 months early, or he didn't cry so loud, or a million possibilities of what that 3-month period is about. But anyways, Moshe is 3 months old when this story happens. What does it mean that he is that he's a na'ar at 3 months? No, he's a yeled, but he has the voice of someone much stronger. Kolo kena'ar, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, and na'ar as like also a play with the root like litorer, linoor, neor balila, like it has this like awakening capability. So like the sound of someone with that like awakening ability, I think is also kind of interesting as a possibility here. I don't know if that's exactly what Rabbi Yehuda is intending, but that's what I thought of when I read it. And then okay, so Amar lo Rabbi Nechemia says, Im kain asitolo Moshe Rabbeinu Baal Mum. Rabbi Nechemia says, hold on, that's like your description of Moshe Rabbeinu is that he is blemished, like he was a baby with this like really weird voice, like a baby with a non-baby voice, like out of a horror movie. It seems to be sort of the suggestion by Rabbi Nechemia. The commentary on this says, remember, Moshe is a Levi, and Leviim have to be singers, so that it's actually a mum in a Levi to have a messed up voice. It's like a blemish in a Levi to have a messed up voice. Okay, so that's like a place where people take this. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. Ella milamid shastalo imo. Oh, this is heartbreaking. Sorry, I should mention. Milamid shastalo imo chupat neurim beteva. Rather, it teaches that his mother made a canopy of youth, i.e., like she made him a little chuppah for his tiva, for his little ark. Amra shamalo eskala chubato. Perhaps I will not see him wed. Which is like really sad image. So like, what does it mean that he's a na'ar bocha? He's just like this baby, but he's crying under like a little chuppah that his mother sadly made him, in like a idea that she wouldn't see him grow up to chuppah, which is like very hard idea. Anyways, okay, so back to the crying thing. Otherwise, I'm just gonna cry at Heaven's suffering. But right, so we're still really like the Gemara here is really trying to get at Yeled and Nar, and maybe he has this weird voice. Maybe maybe he was just like imagined into adulthood by his mother, and that became clear to Bat Paro, and that then might have been what triggered her chamla, like her pity reaction. Therefore, is not triggered by his voice, but by the love that his mother had invested in him, that in this little arc that she sent him off in. Okay. The Ramban has, I just wanna, he brings in some different he quotes the Gemara, and then he quotes Ibn Ezra, which we didn't look at, who says, like, for a 3-month-old he was unusually developed, says the Ibn Ezra. Ramban says Yoter nachon shenefarish bo shaya bocha kenar becharitzut v'zrizut v'lechin chamla alav. He just had this like strong and unrelenting cry, that there was something about his cry that was like almost advanced. It's actually true, obviously babies' cries change as the baby grows, and so when you have like a really small baby, they're like surprisingly loud for their size, but they cannot make the level of sound that a toddler can make, for example. But imagine the Ramban, Moshe Rabbeinu, like he knew how to cry. Charitzut and Zerizut. And then he brings a midrash that Gavriel slapped him so that he would cry harder, and she would be filled with rachamim and take him in. And then he says, oh, we don't need any of this because actually all these words for childhood are interchangeable, and it's fine. That's like where the Ramban ends there. But I just want to open up one other thing, which is this Chizkuni. So the Chizkuni is Tosfest, and he suggests that actually the Nar Bocha is not Moshe, which is wild, because if you get rid of the Nar Bocha being Moshe, then you have 0 babies crying in the whole of Tanakh. Chizkuni suggests the Nar Bocha, she sees the Yaled, right? She sees Moshe. But when she hears the Nar Bocha, Chizkuni says, the Nar Bocha Ra'ata Aaron Bocha. She actually sees Aaron. So Miriam is there, right? The Torah tells us Miriam was there watching. Chizkuni says Aaron was also there, and he wasn't holding it together, right? Miriam has this whole plan, and she's hatching, and oh, I have a nursemaid for him, this whole thing. But we don't know where Aaron is. Chizkuni says Aaron's there. He's the Na'ar who's crying his little eyes out. But it's not the baby crying. It's the Na'ar crying. It's the older brother crying. And then she sees Aaron, and then she understands, oh, you must be an Israelite. And Aaron is actually what like tips her off to the fact that it's an Israelite baby, which, okay, whatever. I feel like there's other tip-offs. You don't need to imagine Aaron into the story necessarily, but I think just the idea, the move of Chizkuni to say it's Aaron, it also represents a move of like children in Tanakh do not cry. Or babies in Tanakh do not cry, at least. Okay. The next baby in Tanakh that cries is not a baby, but it is the children of Israel, who are then called crybabies by Moshe. And that's sort of also interesting. And I think in the perspective of babies in Tanakh don't cry, adds understanding to Moshe's response. So just like a little bit of background, right? There's multiple places. There's a lot of crying in Bamidbar by Bnei Israel. So here already, I just like underlined all the places, right? Right, people are just, they're hungry for not man, and built there in this ellipsis actually is one of the Torah's descriptions of man, right? But everyone's like, our gullets are shriveled. There's nothing but this man to look at, right? Bilti el haman eibnenu. We just want more food. They're crying and they're crying. And Moshe, right? Pasuk Yod, Veshma Moshe da'am bochel mishpachotav. Moshe hears the people weeping, each clan apart, each lefatach oalo, each at the entrance of their tent. They're just like all gunning together, and they're like, and I don't know if anyone's had like multiple toddlers in their home at once. Like that's my life right now. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and like they set each other off, like that's kind of how maybe the image here, like everyone's like with their family and they're making each other cry and they're all going crazy. Like I think that's like the image here kind of. And instead of chamla, which is how Bat Paro sees the crying, Vayicharaf Hashem me'od uve'enei Moshe. Ra, which, by the way, I think is a very common parenting reaction to crying also. And your kids are crying and it just makes you mad. And here we get to see Moshe and Hashem doing that as well. And then Moshe says to Hashem, why have you like, why is this my job? I hate this. Why do you hate me? Like, lama lo matzati chin ve'inacha lasum et masa kol ha'am hazeh alai. Why have I not enjoyed your favor that you have laid the burden of all these people upon me? And then he says, Hanochi ariti et kol ha'am hazeh ima anochi laretziu ki tomar lai se'eu bechekecha kasher yisah ha'omin et hayonik ala adama shenishbat ala avotav. I don't like this translation. Did I produce these people? It's hariti, it's harayon, right? Did I carry these people? Was I pregnant with these people? Did I give birth to them? Right? Was I pregnant with them? Did I give birth to them? That you'll tell me, carry them in your bosom as a caregiver carries an infant until we get to the promised land. Right? Am I their mother? And actually the Parshanut on this, I didn't bring it for you, or I brought you only Parshanut on the crying part, but the Parshanut on Moshe is actually fascinating. The Ketava Kabbalah there goes into this whole thing about how like mothers have this like higher tolerance for crying than other people, which is like wild. And anyways, so you can all look at that at a different time. But and like breastfeeding and whatever, but he right, but here we have Moshe looking at the people and being like, I am not your mother. I did not give birth to you. Hashem, why does it feel like these people are babies that I'm being called upon to carry in this way? But I actually think, right, if we think that the question, if we come to this idea that the Torah doesn't really have crying babies, with the question then of what is the ethical responsibility that crying engenders in caretakers, I actually think that's really interesting. And that this section is really interesting because Moshe is basically saying crying does engender responsibility in caretakers, but I am not their caretaker, as opposed to I don't know if crying actually engenders responsibility, or at least it doesn't engender like maybe it creates responsibility to like provide for the actual needs of that child. But when your toddler is crying because you don't let them put their hands in an electrical socket, like it doesn't mean that you should let them do the thing they want to do. It just means that like you have to respond to their crying like in some way, maybe, and it's actually complicated, and I don't know that Moshe's response here is not held up as like optimal parenting model, and I even wonder about whatever, this is like a longer thing, Moshe, how much Moshe was involved in even like the babies of his own creation seems very unclear from the end of Parshat Shemot. So we can do that another time also. But in any event, okay, so we have two babies in the Torah. They seem to be Moshe himself, but then the people crying and crying and crying to Moshe, and it actually just makes Moshe angry, and it says, and it makes him want to divest himself of responsibility towards these people. Okay. Ibn Ezra does a really interesting thing here, and we're going to circle back to mourning momentarily, but he actually says, he actually says that what the crying here is not just like, I'm a baby, I'm crying because my needs are unmet. He says, that this is what families do when they mourn for the dead, that there's a misplaced mourning happening here, but that crying here is actually about mourning. And you could look at every instance of crying and find mourning in it, I think. That was a thesis that I played around with in advance of this kind of taxonomy, in advance of the decision to present you with a wider taxonomy than just all crying is about death in Tanakh. But I think if you wanted to get to the position that all crying in Tanakh is about death, I think you could get there. Okay. So I'm just gonna like flag that, and I brought this Ibn Ezra to show you that even when it seems to be explicitly, right? Like we know exactly what these people are crying about. It says we want better food. That's what they're crying about. They're not starving. They have man. They're not even thirsty at this moment in time. All it is we want better rations. But Ibn Ezra still connects it to death. And then like the problem with their crying is that crying is meant to be about death, and these people are sort of misusing the death tool in a way, and that's actually the critique of it.
I'm
Okay.
curious if he does the same thing with tzchok, laughter. Like, is all tzchok about life? If all Bechi is about death, because that's at least consistent.
That's interesting. We don't have as much tzchok in the Torah. Like you have Yitzchak, obviously, like the creation of Yitzchak, and then you have like Rivka and Yitzchak having fun time. I don't know if that's exactly about life. Maybe it's about procreative activity, but it doesn't seem to work for them at that point in time, at least. Okay, that's interesting. I have to think about that more. Where the midrash on Kohelet takes it is like what is chok? It's like it's all national. So there's like Bechia is about like our national downfall, and then chok is like Az Yimale Chok Pinu. And so it's about redemption and exile, which is
Thank
also,
you.
yeah, cool idea. Okay. Let me just look at the chat before. Oh, hi Liz. Okay. To imagine her compassion coming from our own Hashem's when irritated. Yeah. Hashem is most relatable when irritated that Hashem's children refuse to eat the dinner carefully prepared for them. Absolutely true. Okay, amazing. All right, so let's move on to the next addition in our taxonomy, which is prayer, crying and prayer. It's gonna seem at the beginning like only women cry in prayer, but don't worry, we're gonna get to men crying in prayer too. They just happen a little bit later in the order of Tanakh. But so the first woman who cries in prayer and the first person who cries in the Torah is Hagar. Right, so she is this whole story, like the minute you open up this Parshanut, it's like really hard, right? Ishmael is like this big, like maybe he's a teenager, maybe he's in his 20s at this point. He's sick already. They're getting thrown out of the house. She's carrying him. Like imagine a mom carrying like a fully grown child. Like that's the image of Hagar here. And then she just can't anymore. And then vatashlich, right? That's really hard language to like cast down. She casts down, and he's described as a yeled, even though he can't be a yeled really in the chronology of Tanakh at this point in time. But he's like, she's carrying him like a yeled. And then right, she goes and she sits across from him. And she says, I don't want to see him die. And she cries. V'tisak kol avativk. And then, interestingly, right, from the words of the Torah, her crying has no impact. Hashem doesn't hear her crying. Hashem hears Yishmael's. But Yishmael came at Kol Hanar. What is the Kol Hanar? Did Yishmael actually cry? We never hear Yishmael cry. Only Hashem hears Yishmael cry. She's the one crying out loud, but somehow Yishmael is heard. And Rashi acknowledges that, right? She's the one who's crying so loud, everyone's hearing, but actually Ishmael is heard, and it shows that sick people who daven for themselves, their tefillot are heard the most, even if they can't be articulated maybe in the same way. It could be like the undercurrent of that Rashi. But the Midrash understands, and this comes up in a few places, also in Avot Rabbi Natan, a few other ones, that that Hagar is in fact heard, right? And so it imagines David HaMelech saying to Hashem, El dimata shel Hagar lo hecharashta, El dimatia tamacharish, right? You heard Hagar's cries, says David HaMelech to Hashem, but you're not going to hear mine. And what we're going to see David HaMelech crying soon, don't worry. But which represents that she's the person whose tefillah were heard, even though that's not in like the pshat here. But in any event, and it gets understood to mean like prayer, right? That's where Rashi takes it, that she's praying. It's just that Yishmael was silently, I guess, also praying, or not praying through Bechi, praying through cold potentially. And his was heard and hers was not. Okay, so that's Hagar. Obviously, the next woman we're going to is Hannah. She is like crying all the time. She's crying and she's not eating, and Penina's being mean to her. And Elkanah says, "What do you even need children for?" Which is, that happens. That's like a replay of the conversation in our parsha this week between Yaakov and Rachel. But she's still really upset. They're up in Shiloh. He marat nafesh. She's like embittered soul. V'tzipalel al Hashem uvachotzivka. Right. So here we have really explicitly, she's davening and she's crying. She's davening and she's crying. And then, right. So okay. So that's our next iteration of like this woman who's davening and she's crying, and it's really the most clear with Hannah. And here when we get to David HaMelech, finally, so after David sleeps with Bathsheba, he sends off her husband to die in war, and they have a baby, and the baby gets sick immediately after Natan Hanavi confronts King David about the lamb and whatever, theft, etc. So Natan leaves. Hashem et hayeled asher yalda ishet Uriah David. So Hashem afflicts the child that Uriah's wife had born to King David, and it becomes very, very ill. And David davens and fasts and sleeps on the ground, and everyone tries to get him to eat something, and he won't eat. It doesn't actually say that he cried until after the baby died. And then everyone says that, and immediately after the baby dies, Ve'akum David meha aretz, I'm in pasuk 20 here, right? David gets up off the ground, Ve'yirchatz, and he bathes, Ve'yasech, and he anoints himself, Ve'achalif simotav, and he changes his clothes, Ve'avo, Ve'it Hashem Ve'yishtachu, and he goes to the house of Hashem, and he prostrates himself, and and then he goes home, and he asks for food, and they give it to him, and he eats. And then all his courtiers, his servants, say to him, "What is this, that when the child was still alive, you fasted and you cried," right? This is our crying language. "And the minute the child dies, you get up and you're eating." And David says, he says, "I was fasting and crying and all this stuff so that in hopes that the baby would live, but the baby died, so now it's over, and now I'm gonna eat something," which is, I think, really, really interesting. And this is where you really see the like all crying is about death thing like start to come apart, where this is exactly the opposite, right? Crying here is an attempt at tefillah against death. So even if you were going to say that the infertility crying for Hannah, right? So Hagar also, I mean, this seems very similar to the Hagar story, except that Hagar maybe is just crying because her son is dying, not necessarily in tefillah and preventative tefillah. Potentially, at least. That seems like, right, she's given up on him, she's moved away, she's giving him space. And so, right, you could say that that's really about death. You could say that infertility and death, that's certainly what Rachel says back in our parsha, right? If I don't have sons, why am I alive? If I don't have children, why am I alive? And so, right, maybe infertility is a type of death also. But here, I think, is where King David is really where you see, you know, this like tefillah thing is its own thing, right? The crying in tefillah is about having your prayers heard, potentially in prevention of death. And when the death actually happens, he's like, great, I'm done crying now, because what's the point then? So you could argue, like, if you wanted to say it differently, you could say, no, of course it's still about death. It's just about the prevention of death, not about the fact of death, and not sadness over the fact of death. But I to me, this feels like really qualitatively different, that there's a tefillah element to crying that's not just a response to mortality. And Ezra here, it's completely not about, or you'd have to really make a strong argument that this is about death, because in Ezra here, he is just really upset that the people are intermarried. And so Ezra 9 is him just like davening and telling all the people, why did you intermarry, and you have to separate from your non-Jewish wives, and this is really upsetting. And it was very dramatic, and he is praying and making confession, right? Palal Ezra, vadoto bocha mitna pelifnei beit Elokim, and he's weeping and he's prostrating himself, and everyone comes around, and then they said, yeah, we did something really terrible by intermarrying. Okay. But basically, right, we have him again crying in tefillah. So that's another example of this like crying tefillah genre. And again, when we compare that to like a crybaby or whatever, this type of crying is intentional. There's something concrete that we're praying for. I'm crying that I should have a child. I'm crying that my child should live. I'm crying that like the Jewish people have gone astray and I'm supposed to be their leader and no one's listening to me, or whatever it is for Ezra, exactly. But this like tefillah crying is not something that children are capable of, exactly, it seems like. It's not something that babies are capable of. No one thinks that when whoever's crying in Moshe and Nativa, like if it's baby Moshe crying, it's not that he's davening, right? That's actually something different. When the people are crying because their food isn't good enough in the desert, no one's like, oh wow, like they're really davening hard, right? That's not the response. The response is like, sit down and shut up, and make less noise. So that's so I think that like crying versus the like meaningless baby communication, or not meaningless, but like the baby communication version of crying versus the adult crying in tefillah is like a totally different type of crying that exists. Mourning, we're gonna do really quickly. The only thing I would just say that's interesting is that sometimes we see so the first person who cries in mourning is Avraham, who cries after Sarah dies. So right, Ve'avo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. And we saw this also in Kohelet, that hesped and bechia are different somehow. Even though sometimes it seems like in the Parsha Nut on ulivkota, actually some of them take it in the direction of this is eulogy, this is hesped, but it seems to me clear that they're actually different. They're like, the pshat is that they're different, and in Kohelet it seems like they're related, but they're different. And we just see it all over again, you know, in slightly different cases. But when Yaakov thinks that Yosef was died, he's right, vayaveh oto aviv, and also that formulation is different, is the same as livkota. He cried, he bewailed her, right? That I like that translation, actually, bewailed her. Like, it's not just I am crying, I'm crying like for someone, I'm crying over someone. And vayev goto aviv, right? It's that same formulation. His father cried for Yosef. And similarly here in Yirmiyahu, when I skipped a bunch, by the way, there's like a lot more crying over death, right? Everyone cries when Aaron dies, for example, okay? You can think of lots of examples. Rachel mevaka al baneha, right? Rachel, she's not just weeping, she's like weeping she's mourning for something concrete, specific. And like, why is she crying? Because they are al baneha ki einenu, because our children are gone, right? This gone is like a death thing. And then Hashem says, no, they're not dead. restrain your voice from weeping. By the way, right? Bechi and Dim'ah seem different, actually. That Bechi is not about the like physical tears coming down. It's actually this like more like vocal thing that's happening, but it's not. We have a different word for, we have a bunch of words for eulogizing, right? Hesped, kinal, kunin. It's not exactly that either. Like it's like it's a wail. I think wail is a pretty good translation of Bechi. Okay, so right, but it's she's mivaka, she's wailing like over this person, and then Hashem says, like restrain your voice from weeping. Why? Because it's not actually necessary. They're gonna come back. They're gonna return. The death that you're weeping for didn't happen. It's not over. Like it's inappropriate to be crying in this way because the thing you're crying about is a death that is not actually a death. And I think that that's really interesting. That's not just like, oh, you can be sad about the gullus or whatever. No, don't stop crying. Stop crying because this type of crying that you're doing is a death style of crying, and it's inappropriate right now, is the like prophetic care being offered to Rachel there. And then we also see, right, she weeps at night, her cheeks are wet with tears, and Eicha, we're talking about Jerusalem, and she's crying, and she's mourning, right? There's none to comfort her. So, right, which is also interesting that sometimes we see you're supposed to be comforted by, right? Rachel and Yirmiyahu is comforted by like the death isn't real. And here, the city of Jerusalem is crying, and in Menachem La, there's no one to tell her it's not real because actually it's real. And actually all her allies have betrayed her. She's all alone, and it's fully happening. The thing that you're crying for is correct. And that exact same crying happened by the people al Naharu Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu Bezuchrenu Etziu. So you hear it from the city herself, and then you also hear it from the people who were forced out of her. Okay, so that's death. And a really interesting one is the family reunion. So we have, it gets, you see it, just there's like a taste of it in halacha, that family reunion is related somehow to death. That, right, so like if you see someone you haven't seen in 12 months, says the Gemara in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, see someone you haven't seen for 12 months, you say, blessed is Hashem who revives the dead. That actually family reunion potentially, I think, really could be also about death within this taxonomy. It's like, oh, we were far away, now we're reunited, wow, we're alive. I thought we were dead, or I thought you were dead. I didn't see you for a long time. I thought you were dead. I thought our relationship was dead. Maybe I thought our family was dead. There's some piece when you're making a bracha at a reunion of Mechayim Eitim, then there's a death hanging in the rearview mirror of that family reunion, I think. In any event, okay, so that's just like a Gemara piece to family reunion. But we see a bunch of crying, right? So we see in Parshat Vayishlach, Esav runs to greet Yaakov. He embraces him. He kisses him. They cry. Oh, sorry, these are out of order. This should have been first. Right, Rachel. Rachel comes with her father's sheep. This is her meet cute with Yaakov. Vayikasher ra'a Yaakov et Rachel bat Lavan achimo ve'etzon Lavan achimo. Vayigash Yaakov vayagel David me'al pi be'er vayashk et hatzon Lavan achimo. Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel. Great. He does all this hard, heavy work. He sees Rachel. He rolls the stone off the mouth of the well. He waters the flock of his uncle Lavan. He kisses Rachel and he cries. So what is that? Like, this is, I think, one of the really, really interesting examples. And as you read the parsha this week, you can think about, and maybe we can talk at the beginning of next class, like, what is this crying about? I think this crying is really interesting. I do think that the chances of it being connected to family reunion feel really high, right? Yaakov was sent away from his family of birth. He's all alone in this world. He just had, last night he had this crazy dream and Hashem promised he was with him. And then he meets, wow, I'm standing at this well and I've met this woman who is both my relative and I'm now immediately, in love with or whatever. And he cries because it's not exactly a reunion in the formal sense of like we used to be. It's not like a reunion, like we used to be together, then we were apart, now we're back together. But in the sense of I thought I didn't have family anymore. And now God is with me, and now I found you, and now I have family again. And that reformation of family as a source of crying, I think is a really interesting one in Tanakh. And there's really a lot to say. Just like there's a bunch more examples. Yosef is full of tears at his family reunion, tears over and over and over a million times. This is just like one, source 22 here is just one example of many. With the Yosef and the tears and the crying and the family reunion. But the idea that like davening, death, and family reunion as sort of these main categories of times that people cry is really strange. Like family reunion seems like really the outlier there until you remember that family is covenant, right? That for family in the Torah is all about the creation of the tribe, through family. That's where it all kind of comes together. The promises of Hashem can only be manifested if we have children, if there's more. And so then also like all the praying and crying about infertility feels also related to the family reunion. Like the infertility is like the cross section of family reunion and death. And so and then also, sorry, just to like wrap it up with this last example, we have crying in Ruth where Naomi tries to send away her two daughters-in-law. Like this is the end of our family. So family coming together, family potentially separating, but all of that potentially wrapped up with death. And then the examples of prayer really are also potentially wrapped up with that. So I don't know. I guess I kind of at the end wanted to say it both ways, even though maybe we have like subdivisions within ways of thinking about or accessing death as crying. And I think the most kind of evocative or exciting or surprising one is this like family reunion disunion one. But where it takes you is that actually family togetherness and like tribal unity is a matter of life and death, and a matter of the life and death of the covenant that we live out through Torah. And so I feel like that also in that perspective makes a lot of sense as a place where we would cry. We would cry when we separate and we cry when we get back together, because that's actually where the good life is to be found, but it's also where the life that's been promised to us. And a lot of these times also they have to do with the promise with the covenantal promise of unity and of future and future prosperity. So okay, so hopefully we laid out, this was like a quick and dirty 23 out of the or not even 23 because some of that was Parshanut, but maybe like high teens number of the 100 times that people cry in the Torah. But I think every time you hear a cry in the Torah, you can think, is this about death or is this about something that's in some way related to death, like tefillah, family reunion, and maybe like therefore children as really like the outlier to that crying of children is the opposite of death, and that the Torah therefore doesn't contain it. Like there's actually no space for that narrative where that first cry of life is actually a sign of life and a really exciting and important one. And there's no space for that in what the word bacha is doing in the whole rest of Tanakh. And therefore it's basically cut out, which is, I think, really, really interesting and exciting. And I look forward to excavating this further with you guys in future classes. I do need to run in 1 second now. I know it's 5 minutes early, but something with my family came up, and I knew before this started that we would have to end at 8:55. But I will just look super quickly at the chat because people said such interesting things before. Right, Bnei Israel cry after the reports of the Meraglim. David is inconsolable after Absalom is killed. Good. David's crying, and the crying mentioned here, the exact opposite. He stops once his son dies. And the other example is the death of the cause of incessant crying. Yes, I think that King David stopping to cry is like fascinating, and that's what pushes me away from the sense that like for sure all crying is about death. Like that source, Hannah saying it exactly right. Like that source is like the wrench in the whole thesis that it's all about death, and maybe actually tefillah is really like its own separate thing in the sense, but I also wonder whether really all tefillah is like somehow related to mortality and immortality, but maybe in like maybe that's like too dachuk. I don't know. And yes, and many paired with kissing, that all the interpersonal, all the family reunion ones are paired with kissing and crying together, but it's never laughing and crying together, which I think, upholds that Kohelet separation. All right, so come back next week. There will be more. There will be stories from the Gemara, discussions in the Gemara. I'm going to talk about the gates of crying at carrying forward our tefillah discussion that was begun today. Certainly.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and looking forward to seeing you all next week. And I just want to quickly plug, in addition to all of our really wonderful series lectures like these, you can now register for our winter week from December 22nd to 24th, to 25th, and there will be morning and afternoon sessions, and it's going to be really exciting. So you can go to drisha.org/classes to see that. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Rabbanit Sarna. See you soon.